Earlier today I recorded a third section of Nikolai Gogol's The Nose. Well, I sort of like reading my own stuff too. So here's a story I wrote some time ago. Don't worry, new ones are coming, and I think you'll like them. This one's called Shoes Are Made for Walking. It's a rather personal story. Maybe, if I'd been feeling kinder that morning, I would never have been forced to meet Mrs. Harris. She would not have been thrust upon me for tormenting my tormentor. Yet it must be argued, without a hint of apology, that anybody would have been provoked to anger when Nurse Elma Johnson began her morning wash ritual with the following word: biscuits. Pardon me, I said. Biscuits, she replied, and shook her head with all the slow sorrow of the world behind her gesture. My daughter just can't make biscuits. I lay upon my back, my head propped on a pillow, and tried to study the stains on the ceiling. This was my usual ritual for dealing with the revulsion and embarrassment I would always feel when Nurse Johnson gave me a sponge bath. My departed mother had claimed to often take trips out of her body, to astral project and fly as an unfettered spirit to places around the world. Her 3 sons and 2 daughters, of which I was the eldest child, never doubted the truth of these tales. They fit in with her general weirdness. Every morning, during my sponge bath, I longed to be like Mom in just this one way. Although spared the sensation of having Nurse Johnson's stubby, fat-fingered hands roving over my body, I still felt nausea at her touch. To me, her obesity mirrored the flabbiness of her soul. She epitomized the essential peasanthood of the culture she grew up within. Maybe if Nurse Johnson had been born in another part of the United States, she would have been an intelligent woman. Or maybe not. Maybe her innate intellect hadn't been squeezed out of her by life in backwoods Georgia at all. She simply had been born with the mental horizons of a groundhog. For all the time she scrubbed my insensate body, her mouth spewed forth the thoughts her brain dribbled out. In a way, I reflected, Nurse Johnson's ability to talk so much verified the Big Bang Theory. Something could come from nothing. This is not a nice man. Her monologue, with all the twang of ignorance expressed in each syllable, carried on as she flipped me over to wash my back. I have tried. Lord knows I have. There just ain't no teaching that girl of mine. I'm like to go crazy. A biscuit just ain't no good to a man unless he can sop up gravy with it, and my girls are darn near as hard as rocks. Partly from irritation, and partly to distract myself from Nurse Johnson's progress towards the nether region of my body, as judged by the distance of her voice from my ear, I said, "That's terrible, Nurse. A tragedy, really. To think of a daughter of yours putting little baked rocks out of an oven. You must be absolutely mortified. Do your friends know, or have you been able to keep this travesty a secret?" "For your information, Doctor," "Please," I interrupted. "I've asked you not to call me Doctor anymore. I'm now merely Charles, the talking houseplant. For your information, Charles, it just so happens that we gals from the South ain't forgotten what it means to keep a good house. A gal who can't make proper biscuits had best learn right quick. Well, that's why you Southerners die right quick, too." By the way my body now shook on the bed, obviously Nurse Johnson's cleaning efforts had taken on a more vigorous course. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked. "Perhaps a hint will help," I said. Look down at the ground. My body settled into motionless again, so obviously she'd followed the command. "Now, what don't you see?" One peril of reading is outside. To pick it back up. "Perhaps a hint will help," I said. Looked down at the ground. My body settled into motionless again, so obviously she'd followed the command. "Now, what don't you see?" Nearly a full 30 seconds later, she answered, "I don't know." "What?" "Your feet, Nurse. They probably haven't witnessed daylight in years." Her lungs created a vacuum around us as she gasped. "Get the point?" I asked. "Biscuit eaters die young." "I'd rather die a few years early and eat good than live on granola and bean sprouts," she said. "Well, I'm sure you'll get your wish," I said. The room spun as Nurse Johnson flipped me over. Her puffy cheeks were crimson, her fat and shrouded eyes practically closed from squinting. "You," she said, and stopped at an apparent loss for words. "Yes?" I prompted. "You ain't a nice man. You ain't a nice man at all." I opened my mouth to reply, but a scream stunned me into silence. "Regular as a rooster," said Nurse Johnson, glancing at her Timex. "Good Lord," I said. "Who was that?" With the same deep, sorrowful gravity she'd previously offered for her daughter's poor biscuit-making skills, Nurse Johnson again shook her head. "That's Mrs. Harris. We just moved her to this end of the rest home to give the other patients a break from her 6 a.m. wake-up call." "Why in hell does she scream like that?" Nurse Johnson shrugged. "Probably because she woke up to see another day." She stood still, her moon face an absolute blank. I wondered if perhaps the comparative insight of her observation had used up her IQ allowance for the day. It was entirely possible Nurse Johnson was simply trying to remember such vital subjects as her name and how to walk. Eventually the IQ current returned to her brain, for she spoke. "She's been doing that only for a month now, right at 6 a.m. A pause. "Come to think of it, she started her morning scream shortly after you came here. She must have seen us wheeling you past her door, I reckon." As I watched, a slow smile crept across her broad face. "I got a smart idea," she at last proclaimed. "Would it be, say, cover me back up?" I said. "Nope," she replied, though she did indeed flip the sheet and blanket over me. "You ain't exactly going nowhere, now are you?" I shook my head negative. "And Mrs. Harris, she ain't got nobody to come visit her. She's a sweet old gal. Except for that scream first thing in the morning, she's too senile to do nothing but mumble and smile at everybody. What's that wheel the old gal in here for a spell?" I could feel my skin tighten in apprehension. "No, you can't be serious." The smile on Nurse Johnson's face reflected the joy of vengeance. It had nothing to do with Mrs. Harris's well-being. "Oh, I am, Dr. Michaels. I'm sure you know, Doctor, how much a 92-year-old woman needs to talk with someone. Don't you, Doctor?" A nervous bark of a laugh, tinged at the edges with dread, escaped from my throat. "Okay, Nurse. I'm sorry for picking on you this morning. You're a nice woman who shouldn't have to bear the brunt of my disgust at being paralyzed." My words, however, bounced off her receding back. "I really am sorry," I lied as the door slammed shut behind her. Faced with the impossibility of physical flight, I opted to simply not be conscious for the next few minutes. I closed my eyes, expelled all the air from my lungs, then held my breath, hoping to pass out before my visitor arrived. It didn't work. Just as I began spiraling towards unconsciousness, I heard the door open again. "Jimmy!" screamed Mrs. Harris. So loudly I started and gasped for air. "Yes, Mrs. Harris, it's your son Jimmy," Nurse Johnson affirmed as she pushed the wheelchair from behind. "Come to visit his aged old mama." I listened to the squeak of the wheels as the wheelchair drew closer to my bedside. With great reluctance, I turned my head toward Mrs. Harris, slowly opened my eyes, and shut them again. This is not funny, I thought. More failure. There was no escape from Mrs. Harris's image. It projected from memory to the private screens of my eyelids. Her face was a stark mass of wrinkles, adorned with dandelion hair, perched upon a rigid, withered stalk which served as her neck. "Now, Jimmy, don't you be a bad boy to your mama. Open your eyes and say hello," said Nurse Johnson. I did so. "Hello, Mrs. Harris. My name's not Jimmy, though. It's Charles." From the depths of her cataract misty eyes, Mrs. Harris stared uncomprehendingly back at me. Slowly, those eyes filled with tears. "Why, Jimmy, don't you recognize your mama?" she said, and her cracked voice fell apart even more from the distress at being so denied. "Has it been so long since your last visit?" There, Mrs. Harris. Don't you worry," Nurse Johnson soothed. She bent down and encased the thin face in her plump hands. "Jimmy's just confused because he's sick. Probably hungry, too." She motioned at the IV bottle hanging on the other side of my bed, which dripped into my veins the nutrition I refused to take into my body the conventional way. If he'd eat, he'd be a nicer man. The nurse straightened and shot her helpless patient a look of promised malice. "Wouldn't you, Jimmy?" I rejected guilt. I rejected any effort to force me to be a mother's son. That role I'd ejected from my life long ago. Get lost, I said, and closed my eyes to prevent the tears coursing down Mrs. Harris's face from affecting that decision. The wheelchair resumed its squeak, this time accompanied by Mrs. Harris's dry, heartbreaking sobs. Only when the door clicked shut once more did I open my eyes again. Yes, I felt a twinge of pity. There's only so much pity a body can maintain, though. At the moment, as it had been for so many moments, that pity was reserved exclusively for myself. With an expression of Madonna-like suffering, Nurse Johnson returned to my bedside. In place of the anger one might properly expect, she regarded me with great calm and apparent sadness. "What?" I asked. "It wouldn't have done you nary bit of harm to be nice to that sweet old woman," she said. "Oh, please," I said. "Don't even try that garbage. You brought Mrs. Harris in here to torment me. Nothing more. Besides, she's probably forgotten the whole episode by now." "I know I brung Mrs. Harris in for the wrong reasons," Nurse Johnson said. "But if I'd knowed you'd be that mean to her, I wouldn't have done it." The words burst out of me before I knew they were going to be said. "Listen, I spent 30 years being the son of a woman who warped my life and my brother's and sister's life and got away with it because we called her mother. Now that she's dead, I'll be damned if I'm going to even pretend any woman is a mother to me ever again. Especially somebody who's going to stop drooling long enough only to say Jimmy every once in a while." With an astonishing leap of thought, Nurse Johnson asked, "Why ain't none of your family never come to visit you?" "Who knows? Maybe no one wants to talk to a houseplant," I said, but the question hurt. Nurse Johnson knew that too. "I think you've been a nasty-tempered man for a whole lot longer than since your accident," she said. "I think it might do a world of good for you to have Mrs. Harris come and sit a spell. You just might learn to be a bit nicer to folks if you got her to talk. She needs someone so, and you do too." The nurse stepped to the TV mounted on the wall across from the bed and flipped it on to a movie channel. "She'll be coming back. You can watch a movie until then." With that, Nurse Johnson lumbered from the room. I mentally tuned the TV's sound and glare out of my senses. Who needed the TV when, without the slightest effort, I could simply retreat into the recesses of my brain and replay the most interesting movie ever made, entitled, "What a Wonderful Life It Was Before the Unfortunate Accident Rendered Charles Useless." Oh, what fantastic, surrealistic scenes transpired. What joys of mental slow motion. Watch as the brilliant 32-year-old doctor begins to cross a bridge in his little Honda Civic. Grip your hands together in fright as he sees a Toyota being whipped back and forth by a way too large house trailer being towed behind it. Squeal as you see that damn trailer occupy the entire width of the bridge as the driver, a middle-aged woman, grins like one possessed and clutches her head, not the steering wheel. Shriek at the spectacle of the young doctor, in equally vain effort, trying to avoid being crushed by backing up. Sigh as he doesn't make it. The bones healed, but the nerves in Dr. Charles Michael's back didn't. Thus did the doctor die and become transmuted into an intelligent vegetable. Since the movie ran whenever I napped, it replayed more often than an HBO special. Mrs. Harris, in fact, interrupted yet another viewing when she woke me for an encore performance of playing mother to her long-lost son. My eyes popped open only to close again as a cold, rough washcloth scrubbed at my face. When at last the cloth left my eye area for a second, I saw Mrs. Harris's bird-like features scrunched together in dismay. "Jimmy, why is your face so dirty? How can you ever eat dinner with dirt on your face?" "Mrs. Harris, that's my mustache you're scrubbing, not dirt," I said, my words muffled by the washcloth draped over my mouth. She held my head steady in one hand, her long skeletal fingers as tight as an eagle's claw upon a helpless mouse. With the other hand, she continued to scour away. Leaning forward in her wheelchair, she put all her strength into the effort. In only a few seconds, the discomfort became a burning over my lip. Tears sprung to my eyes as the burning became a wet, tearing sensation. Was I bleeding? Was she ripping the hairs out by the roots? "Lady, damn it, stop that," I said. She paused to wag a bony finger at me. "Don't you backtalk your mother, young man." The scouring continued with renewed force. Truly desperate for help from any quarter, I called for Nurse Johnson. "Will you come get this senile bitch away from me?" I yelled. "Oh, naughty, naughty boy," Mrs. Harris said, and cut off my pleas for help by stuffing the washcloth in my mouth. Her eyes were completely unclouded. I looked into them and found absolute lucidity. "You always were a mouthy brat." Before I had time to digest this information, the door swung open and my confusion was further abetted by Mrs. Harris's next act. Without pause, she yanked the washcloth from my mouth and fell backwards, limp and apparently helpless, in her chair. The film of incomprehension returned to her gaze. Thus, when Nurse Johnson stepped into the room, all she saw was me, my face red and forehead covered with sweat, practically hysterical over the mere presence of the old woman sitting next to my bed. "Mrs. Harris, why, how sweet of you," she said, as her meaty arms propped her patient more upright in the wheelchair. "You came to visit Jimmy, didn't you?" The sorrow on that wrinkled face as it turned upwards toward the nurse would have softened even God's hardened heart. "My boy doesn't want to talk to me, Nurse Johnson. Jimmy doesn't love his mama anymore." "Wait a minute," I protested. "Look at my lip. Isn't it bleeding? She did that." Nurse Johnson peered at the injured area and shook her head. "'Tain't nothing except a few mussed hairs." She turned to the old woman. "Were you trying to wash his face, Mrs. Harris? I'm very proud of you. I sure can use all the help I can get round here." A dirty look was bestowed upon me as she wheeled the old woman out. Mrs. Harris flopped around in the wheelchair like a rag doll, the strength she had attacked me with nowhere in evidence. Since no pressing engagements were on my social agenda for the evening, I had oodles of time to wonder about the abrupt malice Mrs. Harris had shown. Especially bothersome was her calling me a mouthy brat. Had to pause there for a quick drink of LaCroix. It's supposed to be lemon. I think they drove past a lemon field, and so they put that on the can, just like the cranberries. The cranberry flavor, any flavor they call it. They drove past one of those fields and they said, "That is now essenced." During my teenage years, when the rebellion against my real mother's tyranny first burst into open warfare, her initial insult to me was exactly that term. The sheer coincidence of Mrs. Harris's use of that phrase did not alleviate the further distaste I now held for her. Promptly at 6 a.m., the screams swept me from the inadequate refuge slumber brings. If my body could have jumped, it would have. When Nurse Johnson performed her dusting chores upon me that morning, she possessed an entirely new trait: silence. Not a word did she speak. You'd think this would have been delightful, but no. Such a radical change was ominous. After finishing with me, she bent down and returned upright, puffing mightily, with my old shoes in hand from under the bed. She turned them round and round, as if to excite any fond memories their previous usefulness may hold in my memory. With all the malice a small mind can possess, she then placed them on top of the nightstand next to the bed, a place where they were forever visible, a continuous reminder of how silly such artifacts were to me now. "That's particularly cruel of you," I said, the first to break our silence. "Mrs. Harris thinks seeing them will do you good," she said. Sporting a prim smile of victory, Nurse Johnson left the room. As she had intended, I washed my shoes. Stared at them for over an hour, in fact. Shiny black ballies, $300 a pair. The tips caught the fluorescent lights as I watched. The glare became eyes. The ballies stared mutely back at their old master. "Take us for a walk," they asked. "We're lonely." "Why do you just lay there?" "Sorry, old pals," I thought back. "Why don't you run off and find yourselves a new master?" Hypnotized by those symbols of mobility, I fell back to sleep. In one of my dreams, I was back in high school, jogging down the dirt roads that ran along irrigation canals in the San Joaquin Valley of California, preparing for a cross-country race. In the dream, as it had been in real life, I ran not from intrinsic love for the sport, but simply to defeat others, which had been my motivation in all matters. Mom saw to that. For her, all acts were justified only to the extent one came out on top. when I'd returned home with only a bronze medal, third place, in the mile at the state championship meet my senior year. After going undefeated the entire year until then, Mom asked me, "If you're only going to lose, why bother?" Thus, in the dream, I ran myself to utter exhaustion to escape her disgust. Mrs. Harris cut the workout short. "Time for breakfast, Jimmy. Wake up, my dear sleepy boy." In the exact instant I unwillingly returned to the real world, she thrust a spoon into my mouth. Something with the consistency of glue and the heat of melted wax dripped onto my tongue and burned its way down my throat. I swallowed, not from hunger, but to relieve the pain. "Eat, Jimmy baby, eat," Mrs. Harris said, and thrust another spoonful of the too-hot cereal down my throat. After swallowing, I tried to say stop, and was rewarded with more pain for opening my mouth. Trying to twist my head back and forth proved useless. That iron grip of hers forced immobility upon me once again. "Oh, you were a hungry boy, weren't you?" she said. "You can hardly eat fast enough." And she sped up the spooning, dishing the cereal into my nearly blistered mouth so quickly I came close to choking. Mrs. Harris's eyes, it should be noted, were clear again. She knew exactly what she was doing, feeding me what could now be recognized as thick, unsweetened cream of wheat quickly, so it wouldn't have a chance to cool off. When you are a baby, always squealing and demanding my attention, you don't know how often I long to feed you just like this, Jimmy. The sound of her spoon scraping the empty plastic bowl was a joy to my ears. Pushing the words out through swollen lips, I asked her, "How did you get hold of that food? What are you doing in here anyway?" "Nurse Johnson wants a mother and her son to be close, Jimmy. Even if you hate me, I'm your mother." "You old witch," I said. "You're not senile. You know exactly who I am and what you're doing. You're only fooling Nurse Johnson because she's the first practicing Down syndrome nurse in the country." One wiry hand slapped my left cheek. Her other hand slapped to my right. My teeth gritted involuntarily. Mom slapped me once after I'd grown large enough to resist. She learned never to do that again. I'd slammed her into a wall, with the admonition to remember a little boy would kick her fat ass if she ever laid a hand on me again. My inability to react this time hurt more than the blows themselves. She affected a whimper. "How dare you speak to your mother like that, after I just fed you too? All those years I wasted living in the kitchen, fixing all that good food, and you still left me, you little son of a bitch." "What?" I said. "You little bastard. You and the rest of your brat brothers and sisters couldn't wait to leave the house, could you? Couldn't stand your mother anymore, right?" I took a good, hard look at Mrs. Harris then. Although the crackling voice remained, in words and tone the sweet old lady had vanished, as if another personality had supplanted her own. My heart pounded so hard the bed shook. I tried to speak and no words came. My throat had constricted too much to allow words out. She leaned forward, put her mouth next to my ear and whispered, "I'm glad you wound up like this, Charlie. You were disgusted by my gut, weren't you? You couldn't even bear to hug me at the end. You think I'm so goddamn stupid I didn't notice you flinch when I got near you? And now look." She picked up my right arm and let it go. It fell to the bed like any other inanimate object would. "Even a 92-year-old woman's body is stronger than yours. You're more of a limp dick than your father ever was." Nurse Johnson infiltrated herself into the room. I wasn't aware of her presence until her shape loomed over the bed. The presence that animated Mrs. Harris, however, had retreated. Confusion haunted her aged face again. "You two folks getting along, I hope?" Nurse Johnson's pointed cheeriness, directed at me, was more threat than question. Perhaps inspiration struck, or perhaps instinctive self-preservation. "You bet, Nurse. Mom and I have been chatting like old times. Haven't we, Mama?" I said. From the midst of her wheelchair, Mrs. Harris slowly nodded. This time, her confusion was real. "Oh, good." Nurse Johnson clapped her hands in delight. She peered closely at my chin. "And what's that? Is that cream of wheat?" "It is. You've been eating Jimmy. Your first solid food since you got here. Blessed, blessed me." To tell you the truth, Nurse Johnson's delight at her apparent success made me wish my mental recovery was genuine. As she wheeled Mrs. Harris away, I almost liked the simple soul. Despite her limitations, she really did have her patient's best interest at heart. Unfortunately, the time to dwell on my past behavior towards her would have to come later. Right then, I lay in bed and let the full import of this latest visit strike home. The insults. That sarcastic, disparaging tone of voice. The reference to herself as being dead. I'd recognize that person anywhere. You don't forget somebody after 2 years, especially when you've told yourself to never forget, to never whitewash the dirty memories she'd left behind. That had been my actual mother's spirit animating poor Mrs. Harris's weak mind. I felt certain of it. The bitch was back. This did not take as long to accept as one might think. Though muted by alcoholism and obesity, Mom had possessed unmistakable psychic abilities. The astral projection stories were just one example. She could see ghosts, or somehow feel the memories terrible events left behind in rooms. Ouija boards worked for her. It was not a sign of mass neuroticism or shared superstition that the family's main emotion the night of her death had not been sorrow, but fear. None of my brothers and sisters, or myself, slept a wink that night from fear of her apparition maliciously showing up at the foot of our beds. I, for instance, had been 30 when she died, and tucked the covers over my head for the first time in 23 years. I felt, we all felt, she would revel in scaring the crap out of us. Why would one's own mother want to haunt her children? Because she blamed us for all the supposed professional successes she'd never achieved. Because she hated us for escaping her intricate, spidery web. Because just before she died so unexpectedly, we all utterly rejected her, had decided her many abuses of family privilege severed the already frayed ties that bind. I had no problem accepting the concept of her tortured soul swooping into an innocent old lady's the moment she saw, from whatever subterranean promontory she observed me from, that I was now helpless prey. This explained Mrs. Harris's morning moans, too. Not from terror at being alive, but from not being allowed to live. That her feeble mind could comprehend being displaced from her rightful body, much less resist it, was an unlikely proposition. I stared at the shoes on the nightstand and wished, with all the power hate could muster, to be able to fill them before Mrs. Harris's body was next puppeted into my presence. It's a hateful little story, isn't it? In fact, I resorted to prayer. With eyes clenched shut and concentration wonderfully focused by the desire for vengeance, I prayed for the healing powers to be delivered to me as they are to certain preachers, only in this case to be used solely for my benefit. A ridiculous wish, of course, not to be fulfilled. Less than 3 hours later, Nurse Johnson wheeled the sweet-faced woman back for another therapeutic visit. At the sight of Mrs. Harris's forlorn presence, an intriguing thing happened. A tingle began at the bottom of my spine and flowed upward along its length. An electric current which flowed where the broken nerve connection should never have allowed it. This new physical sensation was pushed away from my attention immediately, for barely had the door clicked shut behind the nurse that Mrs. Harris's mask dropped away and Mom revealed herself. Her maternal greeting. "You're not so high and mighty now, are you, Charles? You were always so self-righteous, so goddamn perfect." As terrible as she'd been in life, the spirit which looked out at me was much, much worse. She'd been stripped of the hesitations, the vestiges of good nature and humanity which had, until the last night of her earthly existence, held the maliciousness in check. I knew, from long experience, how futile arguing would be. Silence was my answer. Silence, and the sweat which rolled down my forehead and stung my eyes. For a solid hour, the specter talked. All the vomity things she'd wanted to expel upon me when alive were now unloaded in death. In life, when she tried this, I could hang up the phone or leave the room. Paralyzed, I lay at her mercy, and she had none to offer. The true extent of her psychotic grievances against me, against my brothers and sisters, against the entire world, were beyond imagination. I almost broke especially when her long, sharp nails scratched slowly over my trembling eyelids. Just one little jab, one teensy poke. That's all it would take to make you blind. Wouldn't that be funny? And then I'd take a pencil and break your eardrums so you couldn't hear either. She yanked my hair hard then, with the command, "Open your eyes." When I did, her face leered a tongue's length away. Her breath, hot and reeking of decay, burned my nostrils. "You stuck-up ass. Always thinking you were above everybody else. You want to know something? I did it all. You should thank me you became a doctor. If I hadn't pushed you, you'd been teaching a bunch of spics and slant eyes or ABCs for peanuts." By this, Mom referred to her unceasing, entirely successful efforts early in my undergraduate days to switch my career desires from being a high school English teacher in California to being a doctor who would whore himself to the highest bidder. "You never did thank me, did you?" she said. "I think you should." I tried to resist by continuing, inwardly, to pray. Those prayers stopped, however, when she again poised sharp fingers over my eyes. "I'm not going to wait long, dear," she said. "Thank you," I said, embarrassed by the high pitch of my voice. "You're very welcome." To my relief, she sat back in the wheelchair and folded her hands primly in her lap. "It's a man's world. I hated having to watch you doing all the things I could have not done if not for you children. Do you know what it was like to have to live through 5 brats? Especially when you did everything so badly." After a slight pause, she added this whammy. "That's why it caused that lady to drive too fast, you know. I couldn't have you living well when I wasn't around to enjoy it." "No," I said, "don't say this. Of course it was hard to take her over. She was stronger than Mrs. Harris is. But I got into her just in time." Abruptly, Mrs. Harris's puppeted face showed weariness. The spirit moving her wavered, then vanished. The old woman, restored to herself, fell asleep immediately. When Nurse Johnson came in later, she bestowed a warm smile as a reward for my seeming goodwill before she wheeled her charge back to bed. You can imagine the effect that final revelation had on me. More than adding to the horror of my paralyzed state, it revitalized my prayers for healing. The tingling in my broken spine grew stronger. These visits became quite regular, twice daily events. Morning and evening, for the next month, I was verbally abused, spiritually spat upon, never to reply, never to fight back. My brain became as soft and cushiony as the body which contained it, a sponge-like entity that stored the inexhaustible hatred vented upon it. And always, the instant Nurse Johnson returned to wheel Mrs. Harris back to her room, the phantom inside retreated, to be seen by no one except me. Love is supposed to conquer the world, to be the guiding force behind all life. I'm here to tell you, this instant, that hate has far more ability to perform miracles in the short term. Every day I concentrate on being able to move again, to put on my shoes and walk to Mrs. Harris's room, to recover the strength in my flaccid arms and banish the hellish spirit inside her to the lower realms it had escaped from. After every mother-son visit, I felt rewarded for my stoicism by God. For surely it was He who saw the justice of my cause, who answered my prayers by providing ever-increasing feeling in my limbs, and eventually the ability to twitch fingers and toes. You might suppose I'd have rushed to break this news to Nurse Johnson and bring the actual doctors to my bedside. No. For surely it would take me away to a rehabilitation center, and that would be the end of my recovery. I knew without doubt that Mom's infernal presence, the intense resentment her words and distorted vision created within me, were directly responsible. With every insult, she gave me the strength to heal myself. Imagine the consternation which filled my soul when I woke one morning to find Nurse Johnson staring down at my prostrate form with anguish in her eyes. "Where's Mrs. Harris?" I asked. "Charles, honey, I'm afraid I got some awful bad news. Mrs. Harris suffered a heart attack last night. She's in her room, the poor soul, resting quietly. Her family asks we don't do no kind of work to save her." A plump tear curled down Nurse Johnson's cheek. "She ain't got much longer. In and out of consciousness, I'm afraid." A sniffle. The poor old dear. She constantly calls for you, just says over and over, "Where's my Jimmy baby?" What happened next caused Nurse Johnson to drop her clipboard. My arms moved. I wheeled my elbows to prop me up, and damn it, they didn't agree to do just that. "Get my wheelchair," I said. "Oh my God," said Nurse Johnson. "Oh my God." Her face expressed both astonishment and fear. Then she whirled around and ran out the door. 5 minutes later, accompanied by seemingly every other nurse or volunteer worker in the rest home, I'd been ensconced in a wheelchair and pushed across the hall. They expected to witness a tender scene. The miracle of one human being coming to life while another slipped away. With the curtains to her room pulled tight, Mrs. Harris lay in the dark. A miniature desk light highlighted her features. Light got lost in the folds of her face. "Please, everybody, could you leave the two of us alone for a few moments?" I asked, my voice a command. The room emptied immediately. Who would argue with a man who had just been visited by a miracle? I sat for a while, simply staring, trying to force life back into the sparrow-like body recently robbed of vicissitude. Although it would be a blessing to mistreated Mrs. Harris's spirit to escape the punishment she'd undergone, I wanted to talk to Mom once more, to show her my regained mobility, to laugh in her face and destroy any pleasure she may have taken in my continued life of helplessness. She would return to hell without even the solace of thinking she'd left me behind in one. Gray fluffs of hair gently stroked the air. Mrs. Harris turned to the light. Mom stared out at me. Though the doll-like face was lost beneath the covers, the spirit occupied and exploded like a son's last breath. Maternal malevolence filled the air. "Look," I said. My right arm lifted several inches above the armrest, followed by the left. "See? You're beaten. I'm going to get well. My life will be good." She smiled. A deep rattle trembled in her chest. "You think so?" A laughter of triumph assaulted my ears. My confidence fled. "What's so funny?" "You were always so goddamn naive," she said. The lips pulled back to reveal bright yellow dentures. "Didn't you ever wonder why I, of all the lost souls, could return? Didn't you question my purpose?" "I assumed you came back to torment me." "You assumed." That single phrase, uttered with a scorching sarcasm I'd so often heard from her lips when she lived, rendered me a frightened child. Nothing she said earlier in all her visits could so effectively destroy my confidence as those two words. "You can move again. You're knitted together." "By who?" "Did you pray to God?" "No, naturally not." "You've always been your own God. You're so filled with yourself, you actually thought you were healed by your own will, didn't you?" The gray head shook with mirth as spittle ran down her chin. "Oh, this is too much. This is exactly how they'd planned it." "They?" I said. "The ones who sent me, you self-righteous prick. The ones you knew, who knew you were your mother's son. They knew you were more with them than I was. Whenever you longed to take vengeance, you brought the spirit that moves me into you." Again the laughter. "You won't ever be completely healed, you know. The miracle stops now. But you are completely damned." Mom's spirit disappeared for the last time. Mrs. Harris, that poor senile soul, looked out from her own eyes. The pinprick of light within snuffed out. "Jimmy," she breathed, and was gone. Nurse Johnson and the others returned to the room barely in time to watch me lean backward in my wheelchair, lift my head heavenward, and pray for eternal paralysis. Well, good gosh, if you liked that story, give me a thumbs up. If you hated that story, but you enjoyed hearing it, give me a thumbs up. Can I write that today? Would I write such a nasty little piece today? My head was in a strange place back then. Well, let's find out. New stories are coming, and we'll all get the answer. Look forward to reading more to you again.